In this video, I'm going to show you how to make perfect, smooth, opaque gouache swatches. I've already mixed up my gouache with some water so the paint is going to run very smoothly. And I've set out some heavyweight Strathmore drawing paper, Strathmore 400 series. There are many other papers that will work too. Just make sure it's a heavyweight paper though, that will absorb the water well and won't warp. I also have a brush that works well with acrylic, watercolor, or gouache. It's a synthetic brush. It doesn't have to be expensive, but these nice smooth bristles will absorb the paint well, spread the paint well, and won't leave any bristle marks in my swatches. Bristle marks can change the way we see the value of the brush strokes by leaving little shadows depending on the angle of the light. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a white swatch in my upper corner here, and then I'm going to make a black swatch in my opposite corner. And then I'm going to start adding black into the white paint and making swatches step by step, working my way down and up the page, snaking my way around until I get all the way back to black. If I'm still at some kind of gray before I reach black, I'll move on to another page. That's just fine, but I'm going to keep going until I have a full range of value. For this first swatch, I'm using a dry brush. I haven't dipped it in any water because I don't want to add any additional water to my perfectly mixed creamy paint. Since I've already mixed up the paint to be a perfect consistency, I want to make sure my brush is quite dry before I dip it in the paint. It's really important. You don't want to add extra water to your paint or else your paint might turn out to be kind of transparent. And then when I paint these strokes, I'm going to go first horizontally, like so. Then I'm going to go vertically, and then I'm going to go horizontally again. So ideally, every time, for every stroke I do, I'm going to have 3 passes. If you start doing more than 3 passes, like 4 or 5 passes, you tend to get less even swatches. You tend to dig out the paint, spread it out, or thin it out too much. Weird things can happen. And also, as I paint each pass, I'm going to overpaint. So I should have really kind of fuzzy edges. I don't want hard edges. I want soft, fuzzy edges, because it means I'm going to be using up extra paint from my brush. And it will prevent me from having ridges or blobs of paint in my swatch. If I do this correctly, I'm going to wind up the swatch that's about 2 or 3 inches wide, probably good enough to get about 2 nice 1-inch square swatches out of it. So let's give that a go. Watch me very carefully as I do this. As you should be able to see here, I am just wanting about half to 2/3 of my brush to be dipped in paint. I don't want the paint to get too high up. I don't want it to get into the metal ferrule, but this is just about the perfect amount of paint that I'll need to paint that 2 to 3 inch swatch. Horizontally, vertically, horizontally again. And I'm not putting any pressure on the brush. I'm just letting it do all the work for me. The paint just sort of floats onto the page. I'm going to wash this off now. First in my dirty water, and then in my cleaner big bucket. So it should run really nice and clean. And then I'm going to dry it off on my rag. Now I'm going to paint a black swatch on the other side. Once again, my brush should be fairly dry. I'm going to be going to do 3 passes horizontally, vertically, then horizontally again. And I'm dipping my brush about halfway into the paint. I think that should be sufficient. Horizontally, flip my brush over to get more of the paint off of it. Vertically, and horizontally again. And you can probably see much better here how I've got these messy edges. I'm letting them be very feathery because I'm overpainting. But remember, nice messy edges means nice clean swatches. Wash that off again. First in the dirty water. And in the clean water. When your clean water starts getting dirty, it's time to go change it out. And dry it off on my towel. Now we need to start adding some black into our white paint. I'm going to use my palette knife to do so, but toothpick or chopstick will work just fine too. And I just need a tiny bit to start. Just a little tiny corner or dab to do it. It takes a bit of dark paint to change this light paint. And we're always going to mix dark into light, never light into dark. It would take a ton of white paint to change this black paint, but only a tiny amount to change the white paint and make it more gray. So I've just got a tiny little corner of my palette knife with a bit of black paint in there. I've even dabbed some off there. It's going to make an almost imperceptible change as I mix this up. But don't worry, it's happening. It's changing. As we go, we keep adding more and more black paint for each swatch, it's going to get darker and darker and require more and more black paint to make a difference. Make sure it's thoroughly mixed. And then I'm going to dip half my brush again and paint a swatch. Horizontal, vertical, horizontal. Overpainting each stroke so I get nice fuzzy edges. I'm going to add another small dot of black paint. And if you feel uncomfortable taking it from the black well, you could take some paint here, put it in the middle. Might be a little bit easier for you to grab it. And I'm just going to take a very small little speck and mix that into my white well. Should be an imperceptible change at this point. And then paint another stroke. And notice I'm not washing off my brush at this point. I don't want it to become watery. I don't want to make my paint transparent. So I'm just going to dip it right in there, and I really won't need to wash it until there's a really big difference between what's on the top of the brush and what's on the bottom. If the paintbrush looks really dirty, it's time to wash it, and just remember to dry it off really well. Okay, dipping about half a brush again. Horizontal, vertical, horizontal. As you get used to this, you can start painting a little faster. Just make sure all of your swatches are about the same size. Each of mine are about 3 inches wide, about 2 inches tall. Try to keep them nice and neat. Ideally, these should look like they were made by a robot, right? Just factory produced, each one about the same as the next. And then we can just keep on going. I'm going to keep on grabbing little bits of black paint. And as you go, you can start adding a little bit more black paint at a time. It'll require a tiny bit more to make a difference. I'd rather have no major jumps at the beginning than to add too much black paint. So take it slow at the beginning. You could speed it up later as we go. Now for this next swatch, I don't want to start back up at the top. I want to start here. I want to be painting in a snake-like pattern. Because if I paint up here, I can't compare that swatch to this one over here. I want to see the values right next to each other. I'm going to keep working like this in this manner, snaking around the page, going on to another page if I run out of space, until I'm almost out of paint. Don't run out of paint completely. It's really important to have some paint left over so you can match paint to it. If you notice that your swatches aren't changing after a while, that they're staying the same value, it means you can add a little bit more paint as you go. Don't wind up with 100 swatches at the end of this. 30, 40 swatches should be plenty. If you only wind up with 20, that might be too few. Really, 30 to 40 would be about the sweet spot. I'm here on my last swatch right now for this page, just calmly and meditatively finishing this one just like I did all the others. I'm going to go on to another page now. And just continuing as before, starting from the top corner and working my way to the opposite corner. If you find that your strokes are streaky, make sure you aren't dipping your brush in water. Make sure your brush is overall pretty dry other than your paint. Make sure you aren't pressing too hard. Make sure your paint is mixed up thoroughly. Those can all lead to streaky swatches. Sometimes people don't use enough paint, which forces them to press too hard. So make sure you're using about 1/2 to 2/3 a dip of paint. At this point, as I'm passing middle gray in my scale, I'm having to add even more black to make a change. Whereas I started just using a little pinprick, I'm now using a little bead of black paint. If you find that your swatch is streaky as you're painting it, you can sometimes salvage it. I'm going to get off all the paint on this brush. I'm going to clean it up on my palette, and then I'm going to kind of swiftly swirl the paint on that swatch and then smooth it out before it dries. This doesn't always work. Sometimes it's better to do a second one as a backup, just in case you don't have to go back and remix that color later on. For me, that swatch turned out streaky because there was some lighter paint at the top of my brush that was dripping into it. So that means it's probably a good time to wash my brush. At this point, I've painted all the way to the second page, and I'm not at black yet. And I find I'm having to add a ton of black into my, well, what used to be my white, in order to get it to be darker. So I'm just needing to finish this up. I don't want to have 50, 60, 70 swatches. I feel like I have plenty now. So I'm going to have one more clean sheet of paper right here. And I'm going to work in the opposite direction now. I'm going to start adding this color into my black. And it should probably just take a few more steps to get those last mixing swatches. Make sure that you have a full range though. Make sure it goes all the way to black and there's no big jumps. But this is just fine to work in the opposite direction for the last few. Otherwise, I feel like this is going to take all day to add enough black in here to make any kind of perceivable difference. So let's take a little dab of this. I don't have too much black left in here. Mix that right up. And get those last 4 or 5 swatches. Once there's no perceivable difference between the two sides of my palette, I have finished painting my scale. I've finished painting my swatches. They all go smoothly from light to dark with no obvious jumps in value. I've covered up my extra paint in case I wish to use it later so it doesn't dry up on me. You can see that the swatches are smooth, opaque. All of them have feathered edges, so all the paint was used up, so there's no bumps. So we'll easily provide 1 to 2 swatches each.